she shot down the human ship expecting a fight. He had other plans. The shuttle's hull screamed as it tore through Ashara Prime's atmosphere, alarms shrieking in 3 different frequencies while James Collier fought the controls with both hands. The warning shot had punched clean through his starboard engine, and now gravity had him in its teeth. He killed the alarms with his elbow, needing to hear the wind, needing to feel the descent. The forest canopy rushed up through the viewport, a sea of deep violet and silver that would either catch him or kill him. He angled the nose up, burned what remained of his maneuvering thrusters, and braced. The impact folded the world into noise and pain. Metal shrieked. Branches shattered against the hull. James's harness cut into his chest as the shuttle plowed through ancient trees, shedding velocity in violent increments until it finally slammed to rest against something solid enough to stop it. The sudden silence felt louder than the crash. James hung in his harness, breathing hard, tasting blood. His left shoulder throbbed where it had slammed against the console. He unclipped with shaking fingers and dropped to the deck, which now sat at a 30-degree angle. Smoke curled from the navigation panel. The hull groaned, settling, and through the cracked viewport he saw only shadow and twisted metal. He found the emergency kit by muscle memory, slinging it over his good shoulder, and triggered the hatch release. The door hissed open, admitting humid air thick with the scent of crushed vegetation and ozone. James climbed out into alien twilight. The forest pressed close, massive trunks rising into a canopy that filtered Ashara Prime's twin suns into columns of amber light. His shuttle had carved a gouge through the undergrowth, a wound of torn earth and splintered wood. James took 3 steps from the wreckage and stopped, every instinct screaming that he was not alone. She emerged from the tree line like something born from the forest itself. Crimson skin caught the fading light, warm and deep as aged wine. She stood taller than him, moving with a predator's economy, and James felt his breath catch as she stepped into full view. Her armor was dark metal etched with patterns that seemed to shift in the shadows, glowing cyan accents at her shoulders, pulsing with her heartbeat. 2 obsidian horns curved back from her temples, framing a face of sharp angles and fierce beauty. Her eyes glowed faint amber, net luminous and utterly focused on him. She carried a blade longer than his arm. James raised both hands slowly, palms open, ignoring the sharp protest from his injured shoulder. He spoke in halting Kharos, the dialect he'd spent months learning from Dr. Nkomo's linguistics files. "I mean no harm, I am unarmed." The warrior stopped 10 feet away, head tilting slightly. Her gaze moved over him with clinical precision, cataloging injuries, assessing threat. When she spoke, her voice was low and measured, each word shaped with deliberate care. "You violated restricted airspace. Surrender or die." "I had clearance for a supply run to the human colony," James said, keeping his tone even. "My shuttle was on a registered flight path." "You lie. Check my identification codes." He gestured carefully toward his chest pocket. "I'm a diplomatic envoy. My name is James Collier." She moved faster than he could track, closing the distance in 2 strides. The blade pressed cold against his throat, forcing his chin up. James kept his hands raised, meeting those glowing eyes without flinching. "Why did you not fire back?" she demanded. "Because I didn't want to kill you." Something flickered across her face, too quick to read. She studied him in silence, and James became acutely aware of the heat radiating from her skin, the faint metallic scent of her armor, the controlled rhythm of her breathing. Up close, he could see the texture of her skin, smooth like soft leather, and the way her pupils contracted in the light. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. Her eyes narrowed. "That is not your concern. It is if you're going to execute me, I'd like to know who I'm talking to." "You talk too much, human." "It's one of our better qualities." James offered a small smile, despite the blade at his throat, along with curiosity and an unfortunate optimism about mutual understanding. She withdrew the blade with a sharp motion and circled him, silent as smoke. James turned slowly to keep her in view, hands still raised. She stopped behind him, and he felt the cold kiss of metal against his wrists before he realized she'd produced binding cords from her belt. "You will come with me," she said, securing his hands with efficient movements. Commander Torvak will determine your fate. And you are? A pause, then reluctant, Rynth. Thank you, Rynth. James tested the bonds, finding them firm but not cruel. Can I ask why you fired on my shuttle? You were ordered to leave Kharos territory. You did not comply. I never received any orders. My communications were clear until the moment you attacked. Rynth gripped his bound wrists and pushed him forward into the forest. James walked, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his mind racing. The attack made no sense. He'd filed his flight plan days ago, received confirmation from both human and Kharos traffic control. Someone had either failed to relay that information, or they'd deliberately withheld it. Your armor, he said over his shoulder. The engravings, are they campaign markers? Be silent. I'm just trying to understand your culture. Dr. Como says the Kharos mark their achievements in metal, that every warrior carries their history. Rynth's grip on his wrists tightened fractionally. You know nothing of us. That's why I'm asking. I'd rather learn than assume. They walked in silence for several minutes, the forest deepening around them. James noted the alien flora, the way the light shifted through leaves that seemed to breathe, the distant calls of creatures he couldn't name. Despite everything, wonder threaded through his fear. This was why he'd chosen this work, the chance to bridge the gap between species, to find common ground in an infinite universe. Rynth stopped abruptly, one hand rising in a gesture James recognized as a warning. Ahead, through a break in the trees, he saw twisted metal and scorched earth. What is that? He asked. Remain silent, but she moved forward and James followed, pulled along by her grip on his bonds. The clearing had been devastated. Prefabricated structures lay in ruins, their walls blown outward with brutal force. Scorch marks radiated from multiple points of impact, too precise to be accidental. James recognized Kharos supply containers among the debris, their cyan markings half melted. Rynth released him and moved through the wreckage, her movements tense. James knelt beside the nearest blast crater, studying the pattern. The destruction was methodical, strategic, not an attack, sabotage. This was one of our forward depots, Rynth said, her voice hard. Destroyed 3 weeks ago by human raiders. James shook his head slowly, still examining the blast pattern. Look at the angles. These charges were placed from inside the perimeter, not outside. And see how the containers were opened before the explosion? Someone wanted it to look like a raid, but they were searching for something first. Rynth turned to face him, her amber eyes burning in the fading light. You accuse my people? I'm not accusing anyone. James met her gaze steadily. I'm saying someone wants both our peoples to think the other is responsible, and if I'm right, we're both pawns in someone else's war. The forest whispered around them as Rynth stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she drew her blade and cut his bonds. Walk with me, James Collier, she said, but know that if you deceive me, you will not see another sunrise. James rubbed his wrists, feeling blood return to his fingers. Fair enough. They moved deeper into the ruins together, neither quite captor nor captive, and the first fragile thread of trust stretched between them, like a bridge across an impossible distance. They picked through the ruins as darkness swallowed the forest, James cataloging evidence while Rynth maintained perimeter watch. Beneath a collapsed support beam, he found a scorched datapad, its screen cracked but functional. Rynth. She knelt beside him, activating the device with careful fingers. Pale light illuminated her face as she scrolled through corrupted files. Supply manifests, she said, medical equipment, communications hardware. Her fingers stilled on the transmission logs. These reports were filed before the explosion occurred. James leaned closer, studying the timestamps over her shoulder. Someone staged this, made both our peoples think the other attacked first. Rynth stood abruptly, the datapad clenched in her fist. This proves nothing. Data can be falsified. You didn't receive confirmation of my flight clearance, did you? Someone made sure you saw me as a threat. Her jaw tightened. I follow orders, even when they don't make sense. The question hung between them. Finally, Rynth spoke, her voice quieter than before. I cannot bring you to Commander Torvak with unverified intelligence. He would see it as weakness. She met his eyes. We investigate. If you are correct, we find proof. They made camp in the lee of a fallen structure using debris to shield against the mountain wind. James built a fire while Rynth set perimeter alerts that hummed softly in the darkness. When he offered her half his ration bar, she stared at it. "We do not share food casually," she said. "It is significant among my people." "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Something shifted in her expression. After a moment, she reached out and took the offered food. "I accept." They ate in silence, firelight playing across her crimson skin and polished horns. James found himself watching the absolute economy of her movements, the deliberate grace that should have felt cold, but instead made him wonder what she looked like unguarded. "Your Dr. Nkomo taught you our language?" Rynth asked. "She's spent 30 years studying Kharos culture. She believes understanding between species is possible." "And you?" James watched embers drift upward. "I believe we're more alike than we think. We both want to protect what we love. We both fear what we don't understand." "Your people express everything openly. We see that as dangerous." "Because emotion clouds judgment, makes you vulnerable. Or makes you human." James met her eyes. "I've read about Kharos bonding rituals, warriors sharing hardship to forge loyalty. That's emotional too, isn't it?" Her fingers tightened. "It is duty, not sentiment. Is there really a difference?" Before she could answer, the perimeter alert shrieked. Rynth was on her feet instantly, blade drawn. James grabbed his emergency kit as 3 drones emerged from the forest, their targeting lasers painting red lines across Rynth's chest. "Get behind me," Rynth ordered. "Like hell!" James ignited a flare and hurled it at the nearest drone. The magnesium light overwhelmed its sensors, sending it veering wildly. Rynth closed the distance, her blade singing through air as she severed the drone's maneuvering fins. The second drone opened fire. Rynth moved impossibly fast, her armor deflecting glancing shots as she wove through the barrage. James spotted cable among the debris, still connected to a power cell. When the third drone swept past, he jammed the live wire into its sensor array. Electricity arced across its frame before it dropped like a stone. Rynth destroyed the last drone with a precise throw, her blade embedding in its core processor. Silence returned, broken only by their breathing and dying circuits. "Not bad," Rynth said, retrieving her blade. Something new flickered in her expression, acknowledgement. "You're pretty good yourself." She moved closer, her hand reaching toward his face. James held still as her fingers brushed his temple, coming away wet with blood. "You were injured." "It's nothing serious." "Sit." James sat while she cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle. This close, he could see the faint ridges in her horns, the way her pupils dilated in firelight, the concentration that softened her features. "Why did you help me against the drones?" she asked quietly. "You could have run." "Same reason you cut my bonds, because leaving someone to die when you can help feels wrong, regardless of species." Her hand stilled against his temple. She studied his face with an intensity that made his breath catch, and the world narrowed to the space between them, the heat of her skin, the rhythm of her breathing, the weight of choices neither had expected to make. A branch snapped beyond their camp. Rynth's blade was in her hand before James could blink, her body angled to shield him. Kharos warriors emerged from the forest in full combat armor, weapons trained. At the center walked a younger warrior with rust-red skin and shorter horns. "Rynth," he said, his voice tight, "Commander Torvak sent us to bring you home." "Kaelin." Rynth's grip on her blade didn't waver. "What are you doing here?" "Following orders." The younger warrior's eyes flicked to James. "He wants the human, and he wants to know why you haven't killed him yet." James felt tension crackle like lightning. Rynth stood between him and her own people. "Lower your weapons," Rynth said, her voice steel wrapped in silk. "That's not going to happen." Kaelin stepped forward. "Torvak knows about the depot. He knows you've been asking questions." He paused. "He sent me to warn you. Bring the human in, or you'll both be executed as traitors." Rynth's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, the same coiling of muscle before she'd destroyed the drones. She was preparing to fight her own brother. Rynth, please, Kaelin said, and James heard genuine fear beneath the formality. He'll kill you. You know he will. Then that is my choice to make. The words fell like stones into still water. Kaelin's expression crumpled, then hardened into something close to resolve. He raised one hand, and his unit lowered their weapons fractionally. I can give you 60 seconds, he said quietly. After that, I have no choice. Rynth looked at her brother for a long moment, and James saw something pass between them. Understanding, grief, farewell. Then she grabbed James's wrist and pulled him toward the forest. Run! They crashed through undergrowth, branches whipping past, the forest a blur of shadow and silver moonlight. Behind them, James heard Kaelin's voice raised in false alarm, buying them precious seconds. Rynth moved with predatory speed, her grip on his wrist unbreakable, navigating terrain that would have killed him alone. They ran until James's lungs burned, until his injured shoulder screamed protest, until the sounds of pursuit faded into the forest's nocturnal symphony. Only then did Rynth slow, pulling him into the shelter of a massive tree whose roots formed a natural hollow. James collapsed against the bark, gasping. Rynth stood at the entrance, her breathing controlled despite their sprint, her blade still drawn as she scanned the darkness. You just made yourself a fugitive, James said between breaths. For me. I made myself a seeker of truth. She didn't turn to face him. Torvak's response tells me everything I need to know. He is hiding something, and he will kill to protect it. Your brother? Kaelin understands duty and honor better than Torvak ever will. He gave us the only gift he could. James pushed himself upright. I'm sorry, I never wanted this. I know. Rynth looked at him, her amber eyes luminous. That is why I believe you. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek with careful deliberation. James covered her hand with his own, the gesture carrying the weight of everything they'd risked. We finish this together, he said. Together? Rynth agreed quietly, and in that single word lived the bridge they'd built across an impossible distance, fragile but worth defending. Dawn arrived in shades of violet and gold, filtering through the canopy above their shelter. James woke to find Rynth already alert, her eyes tracking movement he couldn't detect. She hadn't slept, he realized, standing watch through the entire night while he'd collapsed from exhaustion. We need to move, she said without looking at him. Kaelin bought us time, but Torvak will send trackers. James rose, his shoulders stiff and aching. Where do we go? There are ruins deeper in the forest. Ancient structures from before either of our peoples arrived on Ashara Prime. We can hide there while we plan. They moved through the forest in silence, Rynth leading with confidence born from years of wilderness training. James noticed how she avoided obvious trails, stepping on stone rather than soil, reading the landscape like text. Every few minutes she would pause, listening, then continue with subtle course corrections. You're thinking about your brother, James said quietly. Rynth's stride didn't falter. Kaelin made his choice. I made mine. That doesn't make it hurt less. She stopped then, turning to face him. In morning light, her features carried a vulnerability he hadn't seen before, the edges of her control fraying to reveal something raw beneath. Pain is irrelevant. What matters is duty. To what? Torvak's given you every reason not to trust him. To truth, to honor. Her voice dropped, to not letting my brother's sacrifice be meaningless. James stepped closer, close enough to see his reflection in her amber eyes. Then we make it count. We expose Torvak and stop this war before it starts. Something shifted in her expression. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition that she wasn't carrying this alone anymore. She reached out and touched his injured shoulder with surprising gentleness. You are in pain. You hide it well, but I can see. I'll manage. Kharos warriors learn to compartmentalize suffering. It may help. She pressed her palm flat against his shoulder, and warmth radiated from her skin. Focus on my hand, the pressure, the heat, let everything else fade. James closed his eyes, following her instruction. The ache receded fractionally, not gone, but distant, manageable. When he opened his eyes again, Rynth was studying him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Better? Yes, thank you. She withdrew her hands slowly, as though reluctant to break contact. They stood in the dappled sunlight, the forest breathing around them, and James understood that something fundamental had shifted between them. Not just trust, but connection. A recognition that transcended species and circumstance. His emergency transmitter chirped, breaking the moment. James pulled it from his pocket, reading the encrypted message that scrolled across its small screen. "It's Dr. Nkomo. She says Torvak's forces attacked a human settlement 2 hours ago. 3 dead, infrastructure destroyed." He looked up, his stomach tight. "It's already started." Rynth's jaw clenched. He is creating the war he claims to prevent. She also says she's traced unusual transmissions to coordinates about 10 kilometers north of our position, a hidden facility. The communications array. Rynth pulled out her own datapad, cross-referencing the coordinates with Kharos military databases. Her expression darkened. This facility does not exist in any official records, but there are gaps in patrol schedules, supply requisitions that do not match deployment numbers. Someone's been running a shadow operation. Torvak. Rynth's voice carried cold certainty. He has been planning this for months, perhaps years, staging incidents, manipulating intelligence, positioning himself to seize power when war becomes inevitable. James felt rage building in his chest. How many people have died for his ambition? Too many, and more will die unless we stop him. They reached the ruins an hour later, massive stone structures that predated both human and Kharos presence, their purpose lost to time. Carved symbols covered the walls, beautiful and incomprehensible. Rynth led them into a chamber that offered shelter and concealment, then began methodically checking her equipment. "We will need to infiltrate the facility," she said, inventorying her weapons. "Destroy the array, retrieve evidence of Torvak's conspiracy, and transmit it to both our governments simultaneously." "That's suicide." "Possibly," she looked at him evenly, "but it is the only path forward." James sat against the ancient stone, watching her work. The morning light through the chamber's opening illuminated her in profile, the sharp angles of her face, the curve of her horns, the controlled grace of her movements. Beautiful and lethal and utterly committed. "Rynth, if we don't make it?" "We will make it. But if we don't, I want you to know." He struggled for words adequate to the feeling. "Meeting you, learning to see past the propaganda and fear, it changed something in me. Made me believe connection is possible even when everything says it isn't." Rynth set down her blade and moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "My people teach that emotion is weakness, that bonds outside duty make you vulnerable, compromise your effectiveness." She turned to look at him. "I believed that, until you refused to behave like an enemy, until you showed me that strength without compassion is merely brutality." James reached for her hand. She allowed it, her fingers intertwining with his, the gesture achingly simple and profound. "What happens after?" he asked, "assuming we survive?" "I do not know. I can never return to my former life. Torvak has marked me as a traitor." "You could come to the human colony. Dr. Nkomo would welcome you. Hell, they'd probably make you a hero." Rynth's thumb traced small circles against his palm, an unconscious gesture that spoke of growing comfort with intimacy. "And you? What will you do?" "Keep trying to build bridges, keep believing peace is possible." He smiled. "Maybe with better luck next time." "You consider this bad luck?" "Well, the crash and the assassination attempt weren't great." She made a sound that might have been a laugh, brief and startled, as though the expression was foreign to her. "No, those were unfortunate." "But everything after?" James lifted their joined hands, studying the contrast of her crimson skin against his. "This wasn't luck. This was choice." Rynth leaned closer, her forehead coming to rest against his temple. Her breath was warm against his skin, her presence solid and real and utterly present. James turned his head fractionally, and their faces were inches apart, her amber eyes holding his with an intensity that made the world fall away. "I have never felt this before," she whispered. "This openness, as though my armor has become transparent." "Is it frightening?" "Terrifying," her hand came up to trace the line of his jaw. "And necessary." James closed the remaining distance. his lips finding hers in a kiss that started gentle and deepened with desperate urgency. Rynth responded with a fierce hunger that matched his own, her free hand tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. She tasted of metal and stone and something uniquely her, and James felt himself falling into the moment, into her, everything else fading to insignificance. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Rynth pressed her forehead against his again. "We survive this," she said, the words both promise and command. "Whatever comes after, we face it together." "Together," James agreed, and sealed the vow with another kiss. They spent the day preparing. Rynth taught him Kharos combat signals, while James showed her improvisation techniques with civilian technology. They moved with growing synchronicity, learning to function as one. As twilight approached, Rynth checked her weapons while James secured his kit. "Ready?" Rynth asked, extending her hand. James took it. "Ready." They stepped from the ruins into gathering darkness, moving toward Torvak and the deadly conspiracy that had brought them together. The facility emerged from the forest like a wound in the earth, a sprawling complex of prefabricated structures concealed beneath camouflage netting and sensor baffles. Rynth and James approached from downwind, moving through shadows cast by Ashara Prime's twin moons. She had stripped her armor of its glowing accents, reducing her profile to crimson skin and dark metal. "Two guards at the north entrance," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "Patrol pattern suggests minimal security. Torvak is confident." "Or it's a trap." "Both, perhaps." She handed him a small device. "Kalen's security bypass. If he truly meant to help us, this will grant access." They waited for the patrol to pass, then moved swiftly to the entrance. James activated the bypass, and the door hissed open with a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet night. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a corridor lit by emergency strips. The facility hummed with activity, distant voices, equipment cycling, the subliminal vibration of power systems. Rynth navigated by instinct and memory, reading the architecture with a soldier's eye. They descended 3 levels, avoiding patrols through timing and patience, until they reached a sealed door marked with Kharos military insignia. Inside, banks of communications equipment filled the room, screens displaying intercepts from both human and Kharos channels. James moved to the nearest terminal while Rynth stood guard, her blade drawn. "This is it," James said, his fingers flying across the interface. "Transmission logs going back months. Torvak's been feeding false intelligence to both sides, escalating tensions, making war inevitable." "Can you copy it?" "Already on it." He plugged in his emergency transmitter, initiating data transfer. "This will take 3 minutes." "We do not have 3 minutes." The voice came from behind them. James spun to find Commander Torvak filling the doorway, flanked by 4 warriors in full combat armor. The massive Kharos warlord moved into the room with deliberate menace, his scarred face twisted in something between amusement and disgust. "Rynth," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "I hoped you would come. Kalen's betrayal was so transparent, I knew it had to be orchestrated." "You used my brother as bait," Rynth said, stepping between James and Torvak. "I used him as a test. He failed, as did you." Torvak's gaze shifted to James. "And you brought the human here. How convenient." "Your conspiracy ends tonight," James said, forcing strength into his voice. "That data is already transmitting to both our governments." Torvak smiled, revealing sharp teeth. "No, it is not. This facility operates on a closed network. Nothing leaves without my authorization." He gestured, and his warriors moved to flank them. "But I thank you for gathering the evidence so neatly. It will make a compelling exhibit when I present you both as foreign agents working to destabilize Kharos security." "They will not believe you," Rynth said. "They will believe what I show them. A decorated warrior corrupted by human manipulation, betraying her people for emotional weakness." He took a step closer. "I will give you one chance, Rynth. Kill the human. Prove your loyalty was momentary confusion, not treason." Rynth's grip tightened on her blade. "No." "Then you die together." Torvak moved with shocking speed for his size, his blade arcing toward Rynth's throat. She met the strike, metal ringing against metal, the impact driving her back. James lunged for the terminal, fingers racing across the interface. If he could just override the network isolation. A warrior grabbed him, hauling him away from the console. James twisted, drove his elbow into the warrior's throat, and broke free. He scrambled back to the terminal as Rynth and Torvak traded blows, their combat a blur of lethal precision. The data must reach both sides simultaneously, Rynth called, deflecting a strike that would have severed her arm, or they will not trust it. James found the network protocols, his mind racing through possibilities. The system was hardened against external access, but internal routing, there. He rerouted the transmission through the facility's own secure channels, piggybacking on Torvak's command authorization. Torvak noticed his attention fracturing. "Stop him!" The warriors converged on James. He grabbed an equipment rack and toppled it, creating a barrier of sparking electronics. Rynth used the distraction to press her attack, driving Torvak back with a combination that drew first blood, a shallow cut across his ribs. The warlord roared, his fury unleashed. He abandoned technique for raw power, each strike meant to overwhelm rather than outmaneuver. Rynth gave ground, her movements purely defensive now, buying time. "James! Almost there!" He initiated the transmission, watching the progress bar crawl forward. 30 seconds. That was all they needed. Torvak's blade caught Rynth across the shoulder, cutting through armor and flesh. She staggered, her left arm hanging useless, but kept her blade up with her right hand. Blood ran down her arm, dark against crimson skin. James couldn't watch her die. He grabbed a broken piece of equipment, jagged metal and exposed wiring, and stepped into Torvak's line of sight. "You want to prove humans are weak?" he shouted. "Here I am." Torvak turned, and James saw calculation in those cold eyes. The warlord could kill him easily, make Rynth watch, break her spirit before ending her life. It was exactly the kind of cruelty Torvak would savor. He advanced on James, blade raised. James held his improvised weapon, knowing it was useless, but refusing to show fear. If these were his last moments, he would face them standing. Rynth moved behind Torvak, her injured arm forgotten. Her blade found the gap in his armor at the base of his spine, driving deep with all her remaining strength. Torvak's eyes went wide, shock replacing arrogance. He tried to turn, but his legs wouldn't respond. "You were wrong," Rynth said, her voice steady despite her wounds. "Emotion is not weakness. It is what makes strength meaningful." Torvak collapsed, his blade clattering from nerveless fingers. The remaining warriors stood frozen, uncertain whether to avenge their commander or accept the truth unfolding before them. The terminal chimed, transmission complete. James moved to Rynth's side as she swayed, catching her before she fell. Her blood soaked into his clothes, hot and viscous. "We need medical attention," he said to the warriors. "Now, or do you want to add her death to Torvak's crimes?" One warrior lowered his weapon, then another. The spell of Torvak's command broken, they were simply soldiers facing an uncomfortable truth. 3 days later, James watched through observation glass as Rynth slept in the colony medical wing. Dr. Nkomo stood beside him. "She'll recover fully," the doctor said. "And politically? Both governments received the data. Torvak's conspiracy is exposed. Peace negotiations are beginning." Nkomo adjusted her glasses. "You're staying?" James nodded. "I've been asked to serve as liaison, and Rynth needs someone who understands what she sacrificed." Inside, Rynth's eyes opened. Seeing James through the glass, her expression softened into a rare smile. He entered, moving to her bedside. "How do you feel?" Alive, she reached for his hand, grateful. "For what?" "For you, for showing me that strength without compassion is merely brutality." Her fingers intertwined with his. James leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "We did this together." "Yes, together." She pulled him closer, their lips meeting in a kiss that held promise and hope. When they parted, her amber eyes glowed with something deeper than biology. Joy, perhaps. "What happens now?" she asked. "We build the bridge we fought for," James smiled. "Together for as long as you'll have me." "That may be a very long time, human." "I'm counting on it." Outside, Ashara Prime's twin suns rose over the horizon, painting the sky in violet and gold, a new day for two species learning partnership in an infinite universe.